Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening. I'm Kurt Landgraf. I'm the president of Washington College. Welcome to the 13th Annual George Washington Prize celebration. This year, we're honoring author and historian Nathaniel Philbrick, the winner of the 2017 prize for his book, Valiant Ambition, George Washington, Benedict Arnold, and the Fate of the American Revolution. I was just outside, and I'm up to chapter 3, and Mr. Griswold was about to tell me the ending. I know the ending, I just don't want to hear the whole intermediate part. So it's a great pleasure to see all of you here this evening for this wonderful Washington College tradition of celebrating the winner of one of the nation's largest literary prizes. This award is given annually for the year's best work about America's founding era. The prize honors well-written books that contribute to a broad public understanding of American history and also brings to light new or overlooked stories about our past. The George Washington Prize was established in 2005 at the college's Starr Center for the Study of American Experience in partnership with the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History and, of course, George Washington's Mount Vernon. I'm delighted to welcome tonight our partner in this venture and a good friend of Washington College, Curtis Vibrands, President and CEO of George Washington's Mount Vernon. Kurt, would you mind standing so we could express our appreciation? And Kurt even better said that he didn't actually want to make any remarks, so we even appreciate that, Kurt. Thank you. A best-selling and prize-winning author, Nathaniel Philbrick is well known for his books that bring to life the most compelling narratives of our nation's past. Acclaimed by our panel of judges as a historical drama of Shakespeare's kind, Philbrick's Valiant Ambition is a spellbinding tale of a people in crisis and two passionate and charismatic men, Washington and Arnold, who shared traits like ambition and an obsession with honor. In this dramatic account, Philbrick shows why and how one became the hero and the other the villain in the American story of birth. Valiant Ambition was chosen from among dozens of nominees submitted to the Starr Center and evaluated by a panel of distinguished scholars in the field, with the final decision made by a committee of judges from each of the 3 co-sponsors. The prize was officially awarded to Mr. Philbrick last May at a gala dinner in Mount Vernon, and it is now my honor to welcome Nate and his wife, Melissa, to Washington College. I would now like to call on stage Adam Goodhart, Hodson Trust Griswold Director of the Starr Center, who will introduce Nathaniel Philbrick.
Thank you, Kurt, and it's such an honor for all of us at the Starr Center to be part of your inaugural week, to be kind of kicking off such a big week here at the college by honoring our founding leader before we all join in honoring our new leader. So thank you, and we're proud. I'm going to, in just a moment, introduce Nat Philbrick. But before I do that, there's somebody else that I wanted to recognize here. So for many years, Washington College and the CB Starr Center have administered the not very glamorous but very important part of the Washington Prize process, where dozens and dozens of books are collected every year from publishers all around the nation, gathering together books that are wonderful and some not so wonderful even, to be passed along to our distinguished jurors and evaluated for the Washington Prize. Our dear friends at Mount Vernon have very generously now offered to, without charge, take on that part of the process from us. We're handing it off to them as we continue our partnership in so many other ways, but we have a colleague at the Starr Center who has worked so hard and done such great work over the years to administer that part of the process, and I would like to recognize her. Jean Wertman, where are you? And Jean, we have for you Congratulations.
Thank you.
It's a gift from all of Jean's colleagues, a rare book on George Washington. I'm going to spend just a couple minutes introducing Nat Philbrick. Then he'll be speaking from this lectern for about 20 minutes, and then he'll join me over here for a little sort of Oprah Winfrey style action where we talk back and forth about the book and try to sort of get under the hood a little bit of how this book came to be and some of Nat's other work. Afterwards, we invite you to join us for the reception out in the lobby. There will not be an open Q&A at the end of this, but Nat will be signing books, and I'm sure glad to talk to folks as well. And as usual at Star Center events, for Washington College students, those books are 50% off. So we invite you to pick up those as well. So it always is a real pleasure to welcome the Washington Prize winner to Washington College, but this year feels like a particularly special occasion. And that's partly because of just how excited I am to introduce Nat Philbrick, who's here visiting with his wife, Melissa. Is Melissa? There's Melissa. Hi, Melissa. They're here from their residence, their year-round residence on the island of Nantucket. I've been reading and admiring Nat's work for almost 2 decades, ever since the publication of his acclaimed book, In the Heart of the Sea, The Tragedy of the Whale Ship Essex, which I'm sure many of you have also read. And that book tells the true story that inspired Melville's Moby Dick, the story of how one day in 1819, an exceptionally large and exceptionally ornery sperm whale attacked an American whale ship in the South Pacific, sinking the ship and launching the surviving crew members in an epic ordeal of a journey in open boats crossing thousands of miles of ocean. It's a suspenseful yarn. It's rich in characters, in wonderful details, in sly ironies and backstories. There's one that particularly stayed with me. There was a cabin boy, as I remember the story, I didn't go back and look it up, but there was a cabin boy who was the nephew of the captain. And as they were departing Nantucket, the boy's mother said to her brother, the captain, "Now, take particularly good care of young Johnny for me." And he said, "Yes, I'll do that for you." And so they went off to sea. And so a couple of years later, when they come back having survived this ordeal, mother comes rushing down to the dock and says, "And where's young Johnny?" And the captain says, "Well, we ate him somewhere off the Galapagos Islands." That's maybe a little bit of an exaggerated version of the story, but it's one that stayed with me for the 17 years since I read the book in some form. The book, as you know, was a huge success. It landed on the New York Times bestseller list. It eventually inspired a major Hollywood film directed by John Howard. It won the National Book Award in nonfiction. And since then, Nat has gone on to publish 6 more major books, most of them also bestsellers, and several of them prize winners, including Mayflower, a story of courage, community, and war, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History. That book was followed by the equally acclaimed The Last Stand, Custer, Sitting Bull, and the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And then in 2013, his first book in a trilogy on the Revolutionary War, Bunker Hill, A City, a Siege, a Revolution. And that book, too, has recently been optioned by Warner Brothers with Ben Affleck on board as the director. But there's another reason besides Nat Philbrick's general awesomeness that this year feels special for me. I think since last fall, many of us, no matter what our political orientations, have spent a good bit of time thinking about this country and whether this fractured country can stitch itself back together again, and if so, how. Now, my own belief, and maybe this is my bias as a historian speaking, but my own belief is that our common American identity comes not from a shared culture or ethnicity, not even from a shared language, although some people would like for us to think so, and certainly not, obviously not, from a shared set of political beliefs, but rather from a shared narrative history, a national story that we're constantly arguing about, revising, rewriting, tearing pages out and gluing new pages in, sort of like Thomas Jefferson did with the Bible, if you see that in the Smithsonian, chopped it up into pieces, threw away the parts that he disagreed with, took all the rest and glued it back in the order that he wanted. That's what we're always doing with American history. And no matter how chopped up and dog-eared that book gets, no matter how different our copies end up looking from one another, we are all still working with the same story. And whether the debate is about race or immigration or Confederate statues, 9 times out of 10 you'll hear the argument coming back to a contest of competing storylines. Excuse me. I'm getting over a throat bug that comes from breathing in the dust of history in the Library of Congress. So I think that's why we need narrative historians now more than ever, people who discover new stories and find fresh ways to tell the old ones. That's what made it especially wonderful to see Nat generously spending time with our students, the storytellers of tomorrow, at dinner last night, at lunch today, and even on a little boating on the Chester River this morning. And that's also why I'm so delighted to welcome to Washington College one of our country's best narrative historians, Nathaniel Philbrick.
Adam. Well, thank you. It is an immense pleasure to be here. I was first here more than 15 years ago, and it's Chestertown quickly became one of my favorite places on the planet, and to be here with Melissa under these circumstances, it just doesn't get any better. So to have won the Washington Prize means so much to me, and particularly given the level of the other nominees, it's just I still just can't believe it. And so it's great to be here tonight and have a chance to talk about the book and whatever we end up talking about. And for me, this book began really 31 years ago when Melissa and I moved to Nantucket Island. I was not a historian by training. I was an English major and a sailing journalist. And I was really excited about going to Nantucket because it was the port of the Pequot, and Moby Dick was my favorite novel. But I very soon became absolutely fascinated by the history of what was the whaling capital of the world. And I began to research what would be my first work of history, away offshore, a history of Nantucket through the whaling era. And one of the books I read in researching that led me to writing Valiant Ambition. And it's a book by Saint Jean de Crèvecoeur. I think it's the greatest book about America in the 18th century, written in the 18th century, Letters from an American Farmer. Crèvecoeur was petty nobility in France, fought on the side of France during the French and Indian War, and under circumstances that we're still not sure about, ends up in America, living the life of a farmer on the Hudson River Valley, married to an American woman. And he loves America. This is, he travels all over the country. And he would write these 12 letters about America, 4 of which are about Nantucket, and that's why I was reading it. And he travels down the Mississippi, he visits virtually every colony, and it's a paradise. It doesn't make any difference what nationality, what class. You can come to this place and you can make a name for yourself. Crèvecoeur says famously, "What is this new man, this American?" And it's a love song to this new land through the first 11 letters. And then there is the last and 12th letter. The revolution has broken out, and his paradise has been destroyed. And he says, why is there a revolution? We are the richest, we are the most prosperous, the freest people on earth. Why are we having a revolution? The Declaration of Independence comes to be, and he now is loyalty oaths. And he says, why are you asking me this? I love this country. What is the big problem here? Eventually, and all around him is breaking out not a war against the British, but a civil war across the river from him in Westchester County. It becomes known as the neutral ground, and there's nothing neutral about it. It's gangs of patriots who call themselves the Skinners, fighting it out with gangs of loyalists who call themselves the Cowboys, literally raping and pillaging former neighbors, all in the so-called name of political beliefs. But it's just a squalid civil war. Now, this was a side of the American Revolution I had never really encountered. And I realized I've got to return to this. I mean, what is this about? And so my first book about the Revolution, as Adam said, was Bunker Hill, and it's all happening in Boston. Ever since I wrote In the Heart of the Sea, I love writing about communities under stress, whether they're a bunch of whalemen who've been rammed by a whale, or they're the 15,000 residents of Boston as it becomes a city under siege, as the pressures of revolution erupt. And Bunker Hill is kind of the climax of the book, but really the most fascinating part for me was when George Washington appears in the weeks after that. And this was not the Washington I had come to know looking at my $1 bill. This was a guy in his early 40s, red-haired, fiery, and aggressive. This was not the staid pragmatist he would become. This was someone who was not happy with the New Englanders he had inherited. They attended things called the town meeting, where they learned these terrifyingly democratic notions that if an army officer told them what to do, they said, "Whoa, wait a minute. We will discuss this among ourselves, and if we want to do this, we will be happy to comply with your request." This drove Washington insane, and he decided he had to end this war quickly if he had any chance of making America, making this work. And so he wanted desperately to attack the British in Boston, even though he did not have enough powder. Almost 6 times he would bring the proposal to attack, burn Boston if he had to, and end this thing. And every time his generals would unanimously say, "No, that's crazy." Ultimately, through the remarkable efforts of a former bookseller, Henry Knox, who would bring down the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga, several of which would be placed upon Dorchester Heights, the British would be forced to evacuate, and thus would be the end of what was known as the Siege of Boston. But once again, this was a different Washington. I had to follow where this guy was going, but how to get at that dark middle period of the Revolution that Valcour had introduced me to. Enter my mother, Mary Ann Dennis Philbrick. My mom was marched to the beat of her own drummer. She was a wonderful contrarian. For one thing, she smoked a pipe, which I have to say, when you were a teenager growing up in Pittsburgh on a Friday night at the local restaurant, and my father would light up, it was like, oh my gosh, what is going on? But Mom's hero was Benedict Arnold. And I would go, "Mom, I know you're a contrarian, but really, Benedict Arnold? If someone calls me a Benedict Arnold, that's Satan personified. What are you talking about?" And she would say, "No, there's more to the story. He was one of our best generals. He got a raw deal. You should look at this. I am here before you tonight to say that Mom was right." And I realized Benedict Arnold is the one I want to pair with George Washington. And so thus began what would become Valiant Ambition. It begins in the summer of 1776. Washington, has the euphoria of getting the British out of Boston does not last very long because the empire has decided to strike back, and their focus is on New York. Washington quickly begins to dig in his troops in Manhattan, in the high ground of Brooklyn Heights, where my daughter actually lives now, and preparing for the British onslaught. And during that summer, ship after ship after ship sails into New York Harbor until there are more than 400 British vessels in New York Harbor, 40,000 soldiers and sailors. At that time, Philadelphia was the largest urban center in America, but it didn't have the number of people on those ships in New York Harbor. I mean, it was just a stunning display. And Washington, with a poorly trained army of militiamen, had to deal with a force that not only had all of these soldiers, but had the use of the most powerful navy on earth. And so they could move their... Washington didn't know where they were going to strike first. Eventually, the Battle of Long Island unfolds, and it does not go well for Washington. It is not his finest hour by any means. He's completely out-generaled by William Howe, forced to, in a brilliant retreat across the East River at night, retreats to New York, but is quickly forced to retreat into the Harlem Heights, and then soon is on his way across the width of New Jersey to the other side of the Delaware River, where he loses more than 75% of his army. It's as bad as it can get. And what makes it particularly bad is that the British now have a foothold on the corridor of water that extends up the Hudson River to Albany. A little bit past that, and it's navigable the whole way. A slight jog to Lake George, up that, and a slight jog to the right to Lake Champlain, which is a lake of river-like dimensions that extends more than 100 miles into Canada. This was before multi-lane highways. The way you got around was by water, as anyone who lives in the Chesapeake area is aware. And General Howe had taken New York, and another huge British invasionary force was making its way down from Canada. And if they could take Fort Ticonderoga at the southern tip of Lake Champlain, take Albany, and connect with William Howe, it's the end of the American Revolution, because they would have succeeded in isolating New England from the rest of the colonies, and that's it. And the only thing standing between that fate is Benedict Arnold, who had spent the summer helping to build a fleet of 15 vessels, most of them nothing more than 80-foot rowboats with a cannon in front and swivel guns all around, which had to deal with a force that included a 3-masted warship, several cannon-equipped schooners, 21 gunboats, thousands of soldiers, a large native contingent, and they were all coming down. How was Arnold going to stop them? Well, I won't go into the details. This is why you have to read the book. But what would unfold is known as the Battle of Valcour Island. And Valcour Island is just below modern Plattsburgh on the west side of Lake Champlain. And Arnold, knowing that his fleet would have no chance, and they're all landlubbers, not very few sailors in his fleet, they would have no chance in the open lake. So he hid his fleet inside the tiny bay, inside Valcour Island, lured the British in, and effectively negated the advantage they had, and would fight this slugfest for 4 hours where they just went at it. And remarkably, fight them to a draw. Night would come. His men would escape one by one through the British line. No one could hear anything because they'd been firing cannons for 4 hours. And they slipped through. The fog lifts the next morning, and the British realize they're guarding an empty bay, and they look over their shoulders, and Arnold is 7 miles away, making his way to Fort Ticonderoga. It's an incredible story. He would eventually have another minor skirmish with the British and make his way to Fort Ticonderoga. And as his commanding officer, Horatio Gates, would say, no one has had more hairbreadth escapes than Benedict Arnold. And you know what? He did it. The British go, what the heck was that? If we're going to receive this kind of resistance, what's going to happen when we try to take Fort Ticonderoga? It's going to start freezing in a couple of weeks. Let's try it next year. They turn back. Benedict Arnold, in fall of 1776 has saved America. And so Valiant Ambition begins with Washington, who's destined to be the one man capable of holding this country together at his absolute lowest, and with Arnold, the man destined to determine that it is his destiny to try to tear this country apart and return it back to England at his absolute highest. And we see as over the next 4 years, their paths take very different directions. And you know, my mom had a lot right about the story of Benedict Arnold. She was our best general, battlefield general, short of Washington, in the early years of the war. Washington had huge respect for him. But the Continental Congress, in his infinite wisdom, and I have to say a dysfunctional Congress is nothing new, to Washington's great surprise and horror, in the months after the Battle of Valcour Island, in the months after Washington's incredible comeback at Trenton and Princeton, the greatest comeback of all time, the Continental Congress determines that the major generals upon whom Washington will depend will be determined not by Washington, but by the Continental Congress. And not only that, they are going to institute a quota system in which every state gets 2 major generals. And since Benedict Arnold, who at this time was the highest-ranking brigadier general with the best record, since his state, home state of Connecticut, already has 2 major generals, he will be overlooked, and 5 brigadier generals of an inferior rank will be elevated past him. This horrified Washington. You can imagine and Arnold was a prickly sort who did not take, his skin was quite thin. This began his wondering, why am I doing this? He would fight at the Battle of Saratoga almost exactly a year after his performance at Valcour Island. An incredible, he would be largely responsible for that great American victory. But Horatio Gates, his commanding officer, would get much of the credit, largely because Arnold would be terribly injured. And the last climactic encounter in which his left leg would be basically shot to pieces. It would ultimately heal almost a year later, 2 inches shorter than the other one. It would be a year before he could walk unassisted, 2 years before he could ride a horse. And he began to wonder, why am I doing this? Washington once again had immense respect for him. And to add to it, because of the Battle of Saratoga, the French enter the conflict on our side. And it's, Arnold had a lot to do with it. And this requires the British, who have just taken Philadelphia, to evacuate. Arnold is named the military governor of Philadelphia. You needed someone of great patience and tact to be the military governor of Philadelphia, as the Patriots and the Loyalists began to fight it out. I mean, it's a microcosm of what was going on in America, and this was not Arnold. He would become more embittered. He would marry a beautiful young girl, 18. He was a widower, 36. She was 18, named Peggy Shippen, with Loyalist connections. And just a month later, he would write his first letter of inquiry to the British. And a year and change later, by this time, he was in charge of West Point, our foremost fortress. Once again on that corridor of water, he determines that for the right price, he will turn it over to the British. He has he has to meet the British spy master, a very handsome Major John Andre, and a good friend of Peggy. There's a reason why this all came together. They meet at midnight. You can't make this stuff up. And Andre had been delivered in a schooner named the Vulture. Once again, and they have this midnight meeting in which Arnold gives him all sorts of documents related to West Point. The next morning, Andre is to go out to the Vulture and return to New York, where the soldiers have already been loaded into the ships and are about to come up the Hudson and take West Point, when unknown to Arnold, one of his officers has taken a cannon to the end of Teller Point, fires on the Vulture, forces her down the river. Andre has lost his way out of American territory. That night, he makes his way across the river and now has to make his way through that neutral ground I was referring to in Westchester County, right across from where Valcour was. And this is the land of the headless horseman and Rip Van Winkle. I mean, you don't know who you're going to encounter in the neutral ground, and it's just dawn. He's on his horse. He's just a few miles from British-occupied New York when three men holding muskets step out of the shadows. One of them is in a Hessian jacket, and Andre thinks, aha. And he says, are you from the lower part, meaning are you of British sympathies? And they say, yes. And he says, well, good. I am a British officer on very important business. Let me through. And they say, get off that horse. They turn out to be American militiamen. The one in the Hessian jacket had been a prisoner in New York just a few days before and had used that jacket to help him escape. They discover the documents in the stocking, inside the boot, Andre's boot. And thus begins the process. But they're not sure if they know Andre is a spy. But did he steal these documents for Arnold? What's going on here? Thus begins an incredible race to get. They send a letter to Arnold at his headquarters a mile below West Point to inform him of the capture of Andre. And they send a letter to Washington, who has just finished meeting up with Rochambeau and in Hartford and is destined for, guess what? To have breakfast with Arnold at his headquarters a mile below West Point. The letter to Arnold gets there first. Arnold, by this time, his wife Peggy has just had an infant, their son, and he gets this and realizes Andre's been captured. They're going to figure this out. He goes up to Peggy, says, I'm out of here. Makes his way to the dock, gets on his boat and is rowed down to the Vulture, which is now returned, and makes his way to New York, where he will ultimately become a British brigadier general. Hours later, Washington arrives. Where's Arnold? Oh, he'll be here soon. Just at that time, the next message arrives. And he's surrounded by a who's who. There's Hamilton. There's Henry Knox. And there's the son he never had, Lafayette, that young French officer in his early 20s. And Washington had been a big supporter of Arnold. And he reads these documents and realizes that his best general has tried to betray him. And he turns to Lafayette and he says, whom can we trust now? I mean, that's it. I mean, can you imagine this? And it became a very personal issue for him. Ultimately, Andre would be hanged as a spy, and Valiant Ambition ends with this betrayal. And I'm going to pick up the story. I'm now in the midst of the next book that will continue the story, so I won't go into that right now. We'll see what Ad and I end up talking. But that is the story of Valiant Ambition. And for me, every one of my I think most authors, their favorite book is the one they're in the midst of writing. And they're like kids. You can't decide which one. But I have to say, writing this one was just for me, those two personalities. Arnold, who was convinced he was the smartest guy in the room from day one, and when things went bad would, blame everyone else, to Washington, who had that amazing ability to step outside himself and learn, which is the most important skill any of us can have. So with that, thank you very much, and I will take my chair.
Well, it's so obvious the joy that you found in this book from hearing you tell the stories that just clearly set you on fire as a researcher and your imagination as a storyteller, that I think it's exciting for all of us who love to read and write history. I wanted to mention, so I was out in the lobby, several of us were out in the lobby before this talk chatting with Jay Griswold, who's our president and board chair emeritus. And those of you here who know Jay know that Jay has a way of cutting right to the point. And so Jay asked a question. He said, how could George Washington be so clueless?
Yeah.
And I think that's a pretty good question. I wonder if you would answer that for us.
Yeah, well, for one thing, I think there's a couple of parts to that. Washington was one of those leaders who basically trusted his subordinates. He created a environment of trust and support, and that was, you had to screw up, and then he would change things, and he could come in, but he had that's how his management style in a way. And I think there was also an element about Arnold. Washington was in his 40s. Arnold was almost precisely 10 years younger than he was. And I think there was a side of Washington that kind of wished he was Arnold. As I mentioned earlier, by temperament, he was aggressive. I think he would have loved to have been 10 years younger, not be saddled with the crushing weight of command, and out there fighting. I think there was a part of him that really wished he could be there and had immense respect for Arnold, which was really, of all his generals, was the guy who was pulling that off. And he really needed fighting generals, and it's in any army, that's the Civil War and how long it took for Grant to emerge, and in many ways, I think he saw Arnold as that, and yeah, he did have a blind eye. I mean, there were signs that he was a little, particularly when he was in Philadelphia. He was someone he was impulsive, and he had dedicated a lot of his own personal wealth to the cause when he was in Canada. And of course, the Continental Congress had no interest in paying him back, and so he began to have some insider deals of dubious legality when he was military governor of Philadelphia, and this created all sorts of scandal, and this was going on, but Washington, stuck by him, and even though Arnold would be court-martialed at one point, and this once again contributed to Arnold's ultimate decision to betray his country, and so I think it adds all the more force to that moment when he realizes, all of this support, so respect he had was so betrayed.
So it was almost like one of Washington's strengths as a leader betrayed him.
Yeah,
a little bit, is what you're saying.
And I think, I don't think Washington could have. I don't think a leader, if Washington had been inherently suspicious in any way, and there were plenty of leaders, Horatio Gates, who really aspired to be a commander of the army, and there was what's known as the Conway Cabal. After Washington lost Philadelphia to the British and that terrible winter at Valley Forge, there was an attempt by Congress, but many members in Congress, and it's been sort of dismissed, but I think there's more to it than really has been acknowledged, hey, Washington just lost Philadelphia, look at the hero Saratoga, Horatio Gates, who Arnold despised.
Thought he should be the hero.
Right, exactly, and he should have been. And but Gates was one of those people who was paranoid that that he was always and that doesn't ultimately work. And a sort of a Nixonian approach ultimately is self-defeating. And so yes, I think Washington's great strength in this instance proved to be a flaw, but I don't know. As I say in the book, I think the great irony of Arnold's life is that through his betrayal, it had a galvanizing effect on this country. I mean, he was burned in effigy in Philadelphia and towns and cities up and down the eastern seaboard, and I don't think it's an accident that less than a year later, we have Yorktown. I mean, it happened so quickly after that. And it happens because the British send Arnold, in their wisdom, to Virginia. And, he proves to be the best general on the British side and makes his way up the James River, burns Richmond. Soon Jefferson's running around like a little girl, because, Arnold has the place in flames. And this, what this does to Washington's blood pressure can only be imagined. And he sends Lafayette after him, and thus begins the movement of troops that ultimately will culminate with Cornwallis down there. And, And so it's an inscrutable mystery how we won this revolution. I mean, it just, you can't believe it. And I think Arnold's betrayal was an essential part of that in an odd way.
Yeah, the American Revolution really didn't have a good villain until he came along, did it? I mean, from the Patriot perspective,
Right.
I guess Washington was the villain from the British perspective.
Right. No, and that's a very
yeah,
important point. And we needed a villain. I mean, and that's where Arnold. I mean, everyone knows the name of Arnold, right? I mean, but how many American generals beyond Lafayette and George Washington do people know? Very few. Arnold entered the mythology of this country. I mean, now this is our Genesis story, and we had George Washington, the hero, but we didn't have the villain. And and one of the reasons why we really needed the villain was the storyline of America begins with, you could say, from a British perspective, betrayal. The Declaration of Independence. We were rebels, according to the British. It was an act of disloyalty that founded this country. I mean, we don't think of it that way, but it was. You bring Arnold into it, who, ironically, through being a traitor, he changes that whole narrative. Now, we aren't focusing on the circumstances of what brought on the Declaration of Independence. We have the villain, Arnold, and it is, to this day, he is an absolute essential part of the mythology of America.
But there, you just remind me of a line I loved in your book so much I underlined it in the preface when you call this a book about loyalty and betrayal and the fault line that is in all of us. And so obviously it applies to Arnold, but also clearly applies, as you say, to George Washington and his comrades who were betraying the British Empire in their own way, although they wouldn't necessarily have called it that. They might have considered themselves to be the ones who were upholding what the British Empire was supposed to stand for. But one of the things I love in your work is your sense, this sort of sly duplicity or doubleness in the things that you say, and even in your book titles. The tragedy of the whale ship Essex was the tragedy of these guys who spent months crossing the ocean and had to eat each other, or was it the tragedy of these whales who were being exterminated by the whalers? Or Mayflower, a story of courage and community. Courage and community, was that the Pilgrims, or was it the Native Americans who were their adversaries?
Well, it's nice someone gets these things. You wonder sometimes.
I admire. I'm like, I have to try to do some of that myself, trying to emulate you. But with this book title, Valiant Ambition, could that describe Washington and Arnold each in his own way? Valiant Ambition.
Yeah, I mean, it was a title. All my titles I struggle with. Yeah. I really, it's something. It's so important, and for me, it really was reading Julius Caesar, Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, where Brutus says of Caesar, as he was valiant, I honor him; as he was ambitious, I slew him. And talk about betrayal, and right. I mean, it's all ambiguous. And, I've had people say, well, so what do you mean by that? I said, well, I mean, read the book. I mean, I think that's, and because that was one of the revelations from the beginning for me. What began with Bunker Hill was, I grew up thinking it was good versus evil when it came to the revolution. It was a group of citizen farmers, militiamen, who banded together and defeated the mightiest army on earth and thereby threw off the shackles of British tyranny. And it wasn't anything like that. I mean, it was, it was much, loyalty was, you had families torn apart, much like the Civil War once again. I mean, they're very parallel struggles, and I think they really are, in many ways, part of the same struggle. And so for me, in all my books, I have a deep sympathy for both sides. I really do. But you can't just sit there and not say what you think. And so for me, I really want to hopefully provide the opportunity for the reader to make up their own mind of what they see going on, but excuse me, also, try to say, let my point of view be known.
Yeah, another character, and speaking of choosing heroes and villains, I love the character of Major Andre, who's been a romantic figure in so many stories of
Yeah.
Arnold and the Revolution generally. And he's somebody who, so here's one of Arnold's henchmen, who, unlike Arnold, who becomes the arch villain, Andre is kind of upheld as a romantic hero, including by some of the same American officers, Washington's family, as he called it, who abhorred Benedict Arnold. And then you sort of flip the script on that, and you show Andre as just an absolute cad and jerk. And tell us about, first of all, how did he become a hero, and then who's the Andre that you discovered?
No, that's
It's
inside a little
story.
controversy. I mean, my mother actually loved Andre, so that
he was a good-looking guy.
Yeah, he
maybe,
was. I mean, he's a tremendously, Andre, to my mind, just played it beautifully. I mean, he found, he really was, why he dispensed with his uniform, was, he had been told by Clinton, who was the British commanding officer, whatever you do not do that. I mean, and so, in his capture, what he brilliantly did was say that, I was betrayed by Arnold just as all of you were. And he was the consummate British gentleman. He knew about 12 languages. He would write poetry. He was an artist. He would act. And he was everything an American officer, particularly Hamilton. Hamilton just thought this guy was terrific. And in fact, Washington's insistence that Andre be hanged rather than shot, which would have been a more honorable way to go, almost put a wedge in between the two of them. It was such an emotional thing for Hamilton. But for me, Andre was just this fascinating figure. But there's also a dark side, and I love finding the dark side of things. You're never going to read a Nat Philbrick book and stand up and cheer at the end. My agent and editor really wish I'd write something about a dog, or that would go to heaven. But for me, I have a hard time with heroes, and I have to say Washington's the first time I've actually found someone that even in my most cynical times, I have to say, yeah, but look, what he pulled off. But with Andre had a dark side that got completely washed over. There were 2 terrible massacres of British soldiers during the Revolution. At Paoli, when the British were trying to make their way ultimately took France. They took a sleeping American camp and bayoneted basically everybody, even as they were trying to surrender. And it was known from the American point of view as the massacre at Paoli. And guess who was the second in command, who was the adjutant to the general who was responsible for that, Major John Andre, who wrote very proudly to his mother afterwards about, how they dispatched the rebels. And then, a year or two later, there is the second great massacre that occurred not far from where Andre would ultimately be hanged, where a Colonel Baylor, I think is his name, his men were sleeping in several barns. And once again, guess Andre was there, and they put them to the bayonet. And it was recognized as a terribly horrible, brutal thing, but it really wasn't until 20 years ago or so where archaeologists examined the remains of the soldiers that were killed there, and there's evidence of them being bayoneted in a way that you could only be on your knees when that happened. once again, Andre was there. He was a slick customer who, I think he had a social intelligence off the charts. He could read any group and know immediately what he should be to win them over. And he had gone so quickly through the ranks to become the spy master for Clinton that the Germain, basically the Secretary of War equivalent in London, just couldn't say yes to the promotion. And he worked it beautifully. So for me, I just have to go. That's that for me. And those are the fascinating surprises for me. That even though I think I know what I'm getting into with each book, I've long since learned I have no clue.
That's part of the fun, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is, and then hopefully some of that sort of. What I do is when I'm doing my first year of research, I keep a research journal, and because it's a reading journal, and I just scribble out what my reactions are, And I remember when it was on Andre, my God, look at this, he's Voldemort, that kind of stuff. And because what I find is once I've been researching a topic for a while, you become kind of deadened to the wonder. You realize, of course, everyone knows that. Well, my readers don't necessarily everyone knows it. And for me, that sort of surprise is what I want to communicate. And so I've found that before I start writing, I go back to that journal, and it really provides signposts to okay, what is really interesting about this material? And it's really, I'm in the middle of a book now, and it's been a wonderful, it's like, oh yeah, of course, and I think I would have forgotten that if I didn't have that kind of roadmap.
I want to ask you about that book in a moment, but while you're talking about your joyful research, when we were in the Judges Committee meeting evaluating the different books, we looked at one point just at the footnotes in here, and footnotes can seem sort of intimidating to some people maybe, but if you look at these footnotes, you wrote an entire book, all of these wonderful stories that you didn't fit into the main narrative because you sort of know when to keep it for the notes, but clearly the research was just a joyful process for you, and I wonder if you could tell us about maybe your favorite epiphany moment when you discovered a document or a new fact or a passage or something that you just really loved.
And thank you for reading the notes. Every now and then I get a reader who says, I really love your notes, because they take a lot of, you don't know how much time it takes to...
oh, I know how much time.
Yeah. I know, I'm sorry. Yeah, you do know. But it's just... Anyways, and for me, if you watch a DVD and it's the outtakes kind of thing, that's where I put them in the notes. And I have since my first
the director's cut.
It began for me with Away Offshore, my first work of history. I realized, geez, I can't let this go. So I put it in there. And it's as we said earlier, there are these epiphanal moments, and for me, so much of it, the documents are just so cool. When I was Mayflower, it was having the opportunity to sit down and actually hold William Bradford's Of Plymouth Plantation. The book he wrote, and it's calfskin bound. It's just, short of whatever, it's the best fun you can have. And when it came to this book, and there's the Clements Library, which is on the campus of the University of Michigan. And Clements was a guy who made his money with the heavy equipment that built the Panama Canal. And so he was in the Detroit area, and he loved the American Revolution. And this was in the early 20th century when all of those, the English aristocracy was running out of money. And so he was perfectly poised to buy up the papers of the first ones that I encountered that were there were Thomas, who was the British general at Lexington and Concord. That was
Gage.
Gage, thank you, Gage, and they bought up his papers. and they were delivered in the boxes that Gage had put them in when they were shipped back to Britain, and they had never been opened. They were still wrapped in the red ribbons. And talk about holding history. It was amazing. And they also have Henry Clinton's papers, the Clinton papers. And Clinton was the commanding officer during, he was Andre's boss. And so all of the espionage documents are there. And I mean, it's just amazing. There is, the coded letter in which Arnold offers West Point to the British for a sum. And there is the copy Andre read that was decoded. And there they are side by side. And for me, that's where you just can't sit. You got to walk around and stuff. And so that was, for me, that was just one of those. I can't believe this kind of thing is still available. And yeah, so each book is full of those.
I remember reading an essay a few years ago by a rather dry scholar who said, well, all of us know that at a certain point in becoming serious historians, the romance of holding an 18th century document just loses its mystique for us, and we learn to see them just as texts. And that's when we know that we've become serious scholars. I'm going, no, that's when you know it's time to get a new job. So I'm glad you got that going.
Well,
after
and
so many
it's nice to hear
books.
this from,
Yeah. So just a couple more questions for you. And one is, water, bodies of water are characters in your book so much. And obviously in the whale ship Essex, in the Heart of the Sea, and in your book on the exploring expedition, it was the South Pacific. In this book, it's the Hudson River and Lake Champlain. So your book that you're finishing now on Yorktown, it's really, you were saying this morning, the Chesapeake Bay. And I wonder if you could talk to us, a lot of people here are interested in the Chesapeake. The Chesapeake is a character.
Here we go. Is that better?
That looks good, yeah.
Okay, good. I mean, that's why, part of the reason why I'm so excited to be here, because I am right now in the middle of that book. And Washington, he wanted to have the show down in New York. That's what he wanted. But the French really thought it would be better in the Chesapeake, given, what was going on there. It was much easier, because what Washington knew, and he was really Washington was not a maritime man, but he understood, more than anyone on either side really, that the only way America was going to win this revolution was if the French could provide naval superiority, could hold off that immense British Navy and allow something to happen on land that would be decisive. And the only way that could happen is if they had naval superiority, and it had to happen through the French, since our Navy was a joke, really. And so, it was determined that de Grasse, who was the French admiral, would take this immense fleet from the Caribbean and go to the Chesapeake. And this was all, Washington learns of this in mid-August and has only 2 months to get his army all the way from New York to Yorktown. And it's August. You don't want to march an army into Virginia at that time. I mean, it's insane. But he realizes, and the war is cratered. If they don't do this, we're going to lose it in some form. And so they go for it, And so they marched everybody, through New Jersey, and they're reliving all those battles in New Jersey. They march through there to Philadelphia, taking the water route when they can, and they end up in what's now Elkton, what they called Head of Elk, where I guess you can get a quickie divorce or marriage. Yeah. Right. And that's where they start loading onto vessels and sailing down the Chesapeake to Yorktown. And they would have to, and while they'd set out, and then they'd hear that the British fleet had sailed down from New York, and that de Grasse had sailed out, and there was some kind of battle, but they didn't know what had happened. So Washington hears this just after he's gone to Mount Vernon for the first time in 6 years, 4 months. I mean, can you imagine? going to home, which you haven't been for 6 years, 4 months. And during that time, all of the changes, the defining changes to Mount Vernon, the cupola, the pediment in front, the piazza in the back, those were, he was renovating his house during the American Revolution. So this is the first time he sees all this. I mean, can you imagine? Anyways, so he has a few days there, and then has to go down to Yorktown, and he gets word that the French have left to battle the British. Oh my God. So he has to get the word to all his army coming down. Get off the Chesapeake, because if the British have won, they're going to just scoop you up. So everybody goes into Annapolis and Baltimore, and then miraculously the French win, and it's been really fun writing about that. And they begin the migration down, and so and tiny boats, an oyster, I mean, it's Dunkirk really, and there's accounts where it's an oyster, schooner, and it's so overloaded that there's like 2 inches, and it's blowing 20 knots, and it's waves crashing as they grow through the, and it's just this amazing movement. And so for me, it is to be where I am in the book, and to be here, in Chestertown, and we've done a little driving around the Eastern Shore. It's been very moving and helpful, really, to sort of be here.
Yeah, so, okay, I was going to ask another question, as my last question, but before I ask that, I'll ask this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I'm with you.
All right. So driving around, and when we were out on the boat this morning with Ben Armiger, the college waterfront director, and a student who took us around, what did you notice with your historian's eye about our beloved area here?
Yeah, well, it's all about the rivers, I mean, and the bay. I mean, the French called it the Chesapeake the Little Mediterranean. And they would have said it much better being French. But these rivers are, that's why agriculture was so effective, because you had water transport and every farm backed up. And so it was so cool going up and down the Chester, seeing how it's all laid out, and how agriculture was defined by all of this. And the fact that Chester is so far up the river, you might ask, well, why, how did this become a big, big port? And a lot of it has to do, you've got hurricanes, the farther up you are, the better. And also when it comes to battle, wars, it's much safer. And yeah, you really were not attacked here during the Revolution, right? And I know the Nantucketers, after the Revolution, decided to, and the War of 1812, decided to establish a whaling port in Hudson, New York, which is, so far up the Hudson. What are they doing? But they were doing that for safety. It's not that there are whales in the Hudson. And so for me, being here and then having, driven over, over the Chesapeake, and and just seeing the dimensions of that. It's funny. For me, I have to go to the places in every book, and I don't quite know what happens, but it's funny once I can geographically understand how it works. And for me, I asked to see a chart while we were going around. Ben got one out, and that sort of begins to lock it in a way, and so, I have been looking at a lot of maps and charts. I have my office is just full of them, of the Chesapeake and the whole area around Yorktown. But having now come back here, it's great. I know David McCullough once told me an advice. He said, the time to go to the places is when you've written the first draft, because you know what to look for. And he's absolutely true. So, when I was writing The Last Stand about the Battle of Little Bighorn, I went to that battlefield 7 times. And every time it was different, because every time was in a different place in the book. And so for me now, in this point, in the middle of what I'm working on, this has just been a really special time.
Well, it's been a pleasure for us. I don't know if I think we've probably run out of time, but just wanted to say, anytime you want to be inspired again by the
Yes.
Chesapeake, we would love to have you here, and we really mean that. We love your visits, and it's a great pleasure to have you.
Well, thank you, Adam.
Thank you. Thank you.